coalition, as a region, can work together to make economic development better for your company. There are a lot of great resources out there, and hopefully you had a chance to talk to 6 of them over here with workforce and other resources for our defense companies. If you haven't had a chance to talk with them, please connect with them. What we're trying to do is really just to connect you with the resources that are in the region. And obviously, defense is one of our big economic drivers in this region, and so this is a reason that we've had these events in the past. This is our 4th roundtable, defense roundtable meeting. And the idea is let's bring people together, hear what's going on in your world, and hopefully there are things that we can do that we can improve the economic climate in this area. If you're interested in learning more about some of the programs, some of the resources that are available, please connect with us. We're trying to really promote the good things that are happening here, but also just let you know what resources that are available to help companies to expand. Again, thank you all for coming. We are expecting the Congressman walking up the path as we're talking. So great timing. Great timing, huh? And we're going to start the program in just a few minutes, but first I do want to thank Joe Donovan, principal at Donovan Strategies, for sponsoring us once again and supporting the work. Thank you. The best. All right, for hosting us as well, too. If you didn't have a chance to go on the tour, hopefully connect with, where's Rachel Spiller? I know Rachel's running around here. Connect either with Rachel or with David Luzzi, who is the Senior Vice Provost for Research and the Vice President of the Innovation Campus. And David, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
I'm just going to be very quick. Here on the Innovation Campus at Burlington, Massachusetts, or ICBM. This is, of course, an old Nike missile base, so that's a great acronym for this campus. And you can see all the ballistic trajectories on the back panels there. In any case, we really appreciate the great partnership with the Middlesex 3 Coalition, and we hope for years and years. And hopefully next time you come, you'll see the start of the next building right behind us here, which will incorporate a state-of-the-art clean room facility to really help the region and the university move forward. Anyway, this campus is about partnership between government, industry, academia, small companies, large companies, largely in the areas of health and security. And as Stephanie said, happy to host anybody that wants to go around. I really appreciate the large attendance on the tours that we already had, and look for more of that engagement. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the Congressman and we can get going.
Okay. It's actually going to come over to me if that's
sorry.
okay.
Sorry,
and,
wrong boss.
And then we hand it off to the guest of honor. It's obviously great to be back at Northeastern's Innovation Campus, and thank you, Dave Luzzi, for opening the doors for us once again, and for everyone that took part in the tours. And hey, I think we need to thank Stephanie Cronin and the team here at Middlesex 3 for hosting this now annual Defense Roundtable, and frankly, it's an honor to sponsor it. I think we all know that the convening power of Middlesex 3 is clearly on display here and at every event hosted by the coalition. Middlesex 3 is the go-to organizations for important discussions that impact the people, businesses, and communities in this region. This is not an easy feat, and Stephanie and her team punch well above their weight. Stephanie, we appreciate your time and dedication to this effort, for which we all benefit. Thank you. And while our featured guest, Congressman Seth Moulton, really needs no introduction, I'll do the best I can. Seth Moulton joined the Marines in 2001, days after his college graduation and a few months before the attacks on 9/11. While he was an outspoken critic of the Iraq War, he proudly served 4 tours, sharing the view of many service members that he didn't want anyone to go in his place. now entering his 6th term starting in 2025, representing the 6th Congressional District, Congressman Moulton has continued to challenge the establishment with a platform of bringing a new generation of leadership to Washington, fighting for progressive values while reaching across the aisle. Now, he serves on 3 committees, including Transportation and Infrastructure, and, for the purposes and the reasons we're all here today, Armed Services, where he serves as the ranking member on the Subcommittee on Strategic Forces, as well as the Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and China. I've had the opportunity to work with the Congressman and his team since he was elected. Go along to get along, and we always do it this way, so don't change anything. Our 2 terms you will never hear to describe the Congressman. I invite you to visit his Salem office if you haven't been there, which some people have described looking like an Apple store. Sorry, no iPhones for sale there. And visit his Washington office as well. You will notice a decidedly different setup and feel from other congressional offices. The Congressman's approach to defense and national security are also thought-provoking and foster collaboration. This is a refreshing change of pace, and one where companies and organizations in his district and across Massachusetts benefit greatly. Congressman, thanks again for leading this roundtable and for always being accessible and speaking your minds on matters of defense and all topics. Please welcome Congressman Seth Moulton.
Joe, thank you. That's a very generous introduction, and it's great to be back with you. I know that this is a familiar group for me, and there are a lot of great friends out there, but I hope there's some new people too. And so what I'd like to do is get pretty quickly to questions so that we can take the conversation wherever you would like. But I'll start with a few opening remarks if that sounds good. Okay. So first of all, I want to start with China, the China fight that we want to work so hard to avoid. And we just came out of an election. We never really heard much about national security issues at all. If we did hear about them, they had much more to do with what's going on in Israel or maybe what's going on in Ukraine. But really nobody talked about China. And yet I think this is the most important problem that the United States of America faces today, and I would argue it's probably the most important problem that the world faces, because a war with China could literally be World War III. So let me just walk through this real quickly. If Xi Jinping decides to invade Taiwan, the United States only has 2 options. The first option is to say, oh no, we were just kidding, we're not going to help you out. You're an island a long way away on the other side of the world. We don't care. If we choose that option, a few things will happen. First of all, China will completely control all advanced semiconductors, so we can't have a meeting like this without putting our phones in a lead box outside the door, unless we want China to be listening. Number 2, if the semiconductor factories get damaged in the course of this operation, some people think that Taiwan would rather destroy the factories and allow them to fall into under Chinese control, then we'll have a recession greater than the Great Depression. Some estimate 10 times as bad, because you will not be able to have any chips for any of the advanced things you do, your phone, your computer, whatever else that you have in your house, for maybe 5 or 10, at least 5 years. The third thing I'll say is that even if we decide not to get involved in such a conflict, many wargamers anticipate that it might start with China trying to take out our satellites. They view that as one way to deter our involvement because we depend so much on satellites for communications and positioning and everything else. If that's the case, you might not be able to use Google Maps to get home today. That's the one thing that usually gets people's attention when they think that this wouldn't be such a problem. I think in some ways the biggest hit would be the fact that American credibility when it comes to our promise for deterrence would be shot for a generation. And that could lead to a lot more conflicts and a lot of other US deaths around the globe. So the point is, if we ignore a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, it's a really bad option for the United States. Now, the second option is that we get involved, that we go to Taiwan's defense, as President Biden has said that we will, as many other American leaders have long implied. And if we do that, I can tell you sitting here today as a member of the House Armed Services Committee and the Select Committee on China, I am confident that we will win that fight. I'm also confident that we will probably have Vietnam-level casualties in the space of a couple weeks. Waking up tomorrow with 2 US aircraft carriers at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Because, for various technical reasons, including the fact that we don't have enough conventional munitions, a lot of war gamers believe that there's a good chance that this conflict could go nuclear. It could literally be existential for life on Earth. That's what I mean by saying World War III. So even if we, in theory, win that war, the definition of winning would be devastating. And so that's a really bad option too. And therefore, I just think it's really important that we succeed at deterrence. We cannot allow this conflict to happen. Now, many people will say, wait a minute, Seth, come on. I have a great business relationship with China. I get along with Chinese business people really well. I don't really think they're going to go to war. This is a frequent argument that I hear from the business community. Go down to New York, spend some time on Wall Street. Some of the firms, asset managers, have great investments that have made them a lot of money in China. Come on, Seth, this isn't really going to happen. Well, I will just tell you that I was in Kyiv 2 months before the invasion, and I was struck by how many Americans and Ukrainians on the ground genuinely believed that Putin wasn't actually going to do this. Many argue that he would probably continue his incursions in the east. It might be some minor thing. But the idea that he would actually invade, try to take the capital, and conquer the country was not something that most people on the ground believed. 2 months before the invasion, right? But sometimes autocrats tell you exactly what they're going to do. And maybe we should listen. Because Putin said, I'm going to invade Ukraine. He wrote about it. He prepared his military for it. He staked his personal reputation on it. Well, Xi Jinping has said he will invade Taiwan. He's written about it. He spent billions of dollars building an amphibious fleet. I don't think they're going to invade, Mongolia with an amphibious fleet. He's staked his reputation on this, and he's even staked China's reputation on conquering Taiwan. So I think we ignore this threat at our peril. So when Joe asked me to come, he said, it's Friday right before Thanksgiving. Everyone wants to get out of here. Give them a cheery message to bring home to Thanksgiving dinner. Sorry to disappoint. So let's just talk a minute about how we deter this life-changing conflict from ever happening. Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to modernize our military to meet this rising threat, because China is right now, and for the last 20 years, they have been modernizing more quickly than we are. And that's a real problem. Because they look out and they see a big, old, lumbering U.S. military that still has much of the same equipment they've had for the last 20, 30, 40, even 50 years. Look at how old our B-52s are. While they're producing fighter jets at the rapid pace, they have very advanced missile systems. They have a lot of asymmetric capabilities. I once asked my team to just do the quick math and tell me how many carrier-killing missiles China can produce for the cost of one U.S. aircraft carrier. And the number's somewhere around 1,500. Maybe a lot of those missiles miss, but 1,500 to 1 is not good odds. So we have a lot of work to do to pick up the pace, to modernize to meet this threat, and to fundamentally convince Xi Jinping that on a military level, he's not going to succeed with this invasion, and therefore he shouldn't start. But of course, if you ask the Department of Defense, if you go to the Pentagon and you say, what is the definition of deterrence? They'll tell you military deterrence, but also information, economic, and diplomacy. Those other three parts of deterrence are really important as well, and I've been spending a lot of time on the Select Committee on China trying to focus discussion on how we can have a diplomatic policy that really increases deterrence, an economic strategy that doesn't just increase competitiveness with China, which is actually the verb in the committee title, right? The Select Committee for the Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. I think that's a misnomer. I think it really should be about deterrence. And while we want to improve competition with China, we need to make sure that our economic strategies to do improve competition with China fundamentally come back to deterrence. But let's, because you're all here for defense, the defense industry, focus for a minute on that military dimension. So what do I mean by modernization? Well, first of all, when I co-chaired the Future Defense Task Force back in 2020, which seems like a long time ago, with the pandemic and everything else, we came up with, among our other recommendations, this idea that the U.S. military should focus a lot on AI. And it felt for a couple years like I was screaming into the wilderness talking about AI and how we all need to introduce AI. We actually came up with a mandate that sort of every new defense program have an AI component. But it wasn't until ChatGPT came out that people all of a sudden woke up and said, wow, that's serious. So a few nights ago, we had a talk with the Senate and the House, and Eric Schmidt came and gave a presentation. He wrote a new book. Has anyone read Eric Schmidt's new book? You should read this book. Here's one example that he shared. He said that in the future, you will be able to talk to your phone, your AI assistant, your companion that lives with you, that provides you emotional support as well as helps you do all your... That's not crazy. Like, that's the world to come. And you'll be able to pick up this phone and say, instead of like, hey Siri, call John, and all of a sudden you look up and Doug's on the phone, which is sometimes the way we think Siri works these days, right? No, you'll be able to say, you know what, I'm thinking about moving to Pennsylvania. Go buy me a house. And the AI will, knowing your history, knowing what you like, your preferences and whatnot, will say, okay, where do we need to start here? We need to find a community in Pennsylvania where Seth would like to live. And it's going to maybe talk to other AIs out there, and it's going to look at all the communities in Pennsylvania and figure out the perfect community where I would fit in with my political views and the kinds of, whether I like to live in a city or I like to take the train to work or whatever it is, right? We'll find that community. Then we'll say, okay, how are we going to buy a house? Well, I don't really know how to buy a house, but there's some other engine out there that can do that. And it'll figure out how to go on and essentially do Zillow for you, right? And figure out what house you would like and where to get it. And they'll say, well, we don't actually know how to buy this. This is something that requires, mortgages and banks and purchase and sale agreements, maybe a real estate broker. But other AI engines will figure out how to do that. And this will all happen in the space of about, 30 minutes. And so it's not just like saying, I want to know if there are houses in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. It's literally just saying, I want to move to Pennsylvania, and the AI does all of it for you. So forget real estate brokers, forget all the mortgage specialists at banks. All of this is handled just by speaking into your phone. And what Eric Schmidt told us is that is about 2 years away. 2 years. That's how quickly this is coming. That's how quickly this could all change. Who knows if that precise capability will be available in exactly 2 years. But the point is that AI is going to dramatically change our lives. And if it's going to change our lives that much, imagine how much it's going to change warfare. So if we're not at the cutting edge of that, then China will not be deterred by our capabilities and could very well start this war. The second point I want to make is that even if we have the best AI, like ChatGPT right now is a better AI engine than what the Chinese have. Not by a lot, maybe by 6 months. We're not 20 years ahead. You count it in weeks. But we're still winning this race, if ever so slightly. But this doesn't really matter much for defense unless you can actually produce the things that use this technology. We can have the most advanced missiles in the world that can very effectively take out an amphibious invasion fleet from China. But if we can't produce those and get those on Taiwan, because we sure as hell aren't going to bring them in after the fact, then China's not deterred. So at the same time as we need to be much more focused on the real cutting edge of technology and not just building big old heavy aircraft carriers and fighter jets, like the F-35, the plane designed to fight China that can't reach China. We need to actually produce these cutting edge technologies in a way that we can field them, get them out there, and they can succeed at deterrence. So there's this real sort of, there's two sides to this equation, which is one, we need to continue to be the best innovators in the world, but we also have to just really tune up industry to be able to produce things quickly and inexpensively, which we're not very good at right now. Now finally, I want to conclude by making a few comments about the existing wars, because I've been so focused on China, I haven't bothered to mention that we've got a hot war in the Middle East and a hot war in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. And these are obviously very much on people's minds. Let's start with Ukraine. Ukraine has taught us some amazing lessons of innovation. I remember very well about 2 or 3 days into the invasion of Iraq, when my Marine battalion was making heady progress up the eastern Tigris River Valley. And we were going so fast that we got to a point where we maybe got ahead of things a little bit, and we received an intelligence report that an Iraqi tank battalion was headed our way. And we didn't have any tanks with us. We were just an infantry battalion. That was a frightening moment for a second lieutenant, about 23 years old. And I still remember, to this day, the just emotional feeling of relief that I felt when I heard an Abrams tank coming up the road. And it got closer, and I could smell the jet fuel, and hey, we are okay. That was in 2003. Just 20 years later, I wouldn't want to be anywhere near a tank on a battlefield, because a $5,000 drone could come out of nowhere and just like that, kill a $5 million tank. That's how quickly things have changed. And so we've got a real problem if we're still focused on buying a lot of tanks instead of buying a lot of drones. So don't take from Ukraine the lesson that some of the old heads are taking to say, oh look, see, we still need artillery. Sure, artillery has some point. But trust me, they wouldn't be using artillery if they just had a lot more drones. Ukraine has showed us how quickly the battlefield is changing, and we need to prepare for the future side of that conflict, not the old things that are still happening, because they happen to still have a lot of 155 millimeter artillery guns. The second thing the second piece I'll mention is just on the Middle East real quickly. I wrote an op-ed just after October 7th about how we need to apply some of the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan to what's going on in Israel. It's a counterinsurgency fundamentally. Netanyahu needs an endgame. That was the title of my op-ed, Netanyahu needs an endgame. And in other words, there needs to be a political solution at the end of the day. You can't just win this fight militarily. Incidentally, this is still a problem. He still doesn't have an endgame. This is the very most specific reason why several members of his war cabinet have resigned, and why there's a lot of dissension between the Prime Minister's office and the IDF. But the point, the reason I bring it up and point out that we don't really have a clear way to end this conflict is that this is another war that could escalate, and the U.S. could become more involved, even if we don't want to. And the biggest issue to me with the Middle East is that it's taking attention and literally missiles away from China. Because we don't have an end game for Gaza. The Houthis are still upset, and they're still shooting missiles into the Red Sea, or drones, or whatever else, and we're using the most exquisite missiles in the world to take these things out, and those are missiles that we need pointed at China so they don't invade. That again comes back to the issue of just production. We can have these amazing missiles, but if we can't produce them more quickly, then that's a real problem. So I'll conclude before I just turn it over to you for your questions by saying that this is not a terribly rosy picture that I've painted. I think that this is what we should be most focused on in the United States Congress, in our political debates. It's obviously wasn't even a factor in the election. And so therefore, it's incumbent upon people like you in this room to make sure that despite the fact that people aren't talking about this, that it probably won't come up at the Thanksgiving table, that you understand how critical it is for our future, for our kids, that we prevent this war with China, and that therefore we do a really good job, even if it's a little bit behind the scenes, at getting the United States in the position it needs to be to prevent that war from happening. When I think about my 2 little girls, which I do all the time, I honestly believe that the single most important thing I can do for their future right now is not just be home as a dad, though they really like that, not just make pancakes on Sunday, though that's a promise that I have made and I tried very hard to uphold. It's not just make sure they have good school or things to do after school. It's literally prevent a war with China, because that would be so devastating to their lives. So this is incredibly important stuff. And it's why we all need to really be working as best as we can to make sure that we succeed at deterrence, because it's critical for our future. All right, now I'll turn it over to you for your questions.
I have a question. I'm going to go to Leah. Go ahead, Leah. Yep.
Excuse me. So good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Leah Kirkwood. I'm a new program executive officer at Hanson Air Force Base for the new PEO Directorate for Electronic Systems. So right in line with your discussion points, if we think about the whole of government deterrence, not just the military aspect, but the whole of government, and also the way that technology is often cross-pollinating across different industry sectors against different deterrence elements. Where do you see that there may be increased opportunities or maybe new opportunities for increased collaboration and partnering between our regional and Massachusetts partners, both within the industrial base and the Kansas Air Force Base and beyond?
Well, I think there are a lot of opportunities for partnering on deterrence, but I'll give one that hasn't come up, but it's very central to the work I'm doing on the Strategic Forces Subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee. And that is that, part of deterrence is obviously preventing a nuclear conflict. A lot of war games, as I mentioned earlier, think that just an invasion of Taiwan is a conflict that could get to the nuclear level. And we have never lived in a war before where we have 2 near-peer nuclear adversaries. So all the foundational theories of deterrence, things like mutually assured destruction, right? Crazy concept. No one could imagine such a thing in the 1940s. But it was developed in the 1950s because of this new nuclear age that we were living in. And it's actually, despite the crazy title, has actually really succeeded at preserving peace between the United States and Russia. But we don't really have a theory of deterrence when you have 2 adversaries instead of just 1. For anyone who knows anything about game theory, and I'm not a game theory expert, but they will tell you that it's a very different problem, and it's much more complicated. So we need to go through another round of intellectual development on the theories of deterrence, like we did in the early 1950s, to meet the challenges of this new age. Because only after we have a real solid theory of deterrence for how you deal with 2 near-peer nuclear adversaries should we be making decisions like how many missiles should we buy? How many subs do we need? We're building new ICBMs for the first time since the 1960s. We're building new nuclear subs for the first new ballistic missile subs for the first time since the 1970s. And yet we really don't know, at a theoretical basis, how many we should have. So I've gone to Harvard and I've said, you guys need to work on this. Like, the PhDs here need to be thinking about this. And I think that some of the folks who were actually, producing things that contribute to these efforts, these multi-billion-dollar efforts to build new ICBMs and ballistic missile submarines, you need to be a part of this discussion as well. But that's just one example. There are a lot of others, but I think it highlights how the unique ecosystem that we have here in Massachusetts, with some of the world's top universities and some of the top producers of defense technology really need to collaborate and work together. It's a brave new world, and we're not quite sure how to handle it.
We have a question from John Marshall.
Thank you very much. Seth, appreciate it. So we're a small business and we support surface and undersea combatants. DDG 51 and that's in Colombia. And China's announced the invasion of 1127, apparently, Taiwan. What can we do to get the shipbuilders to build product more quickly and on time? The funding for long lead items on supply chain has been with us now for at least 6 years. And what can you do to create attention if it's 24 months to go, 24 months to meet the challenge?
So obviously we don't know exactly when Xi Jinping might kick this off, and some people think that it could be slightly later than that now, but the bottom line is we've got to be ready. And Admiral Franchetti came in recently and briefed, we have a great bipartisan veterans caucus on Capitol Hill. Many of us sit on national security committees, and she came in and briefed us on the Navy's modernization plan. And one of the milestones in the Navy's modernization plan is to do their first test with unmanned undersea vehicles in mid-2027. Their first test. I told the Admiral, the CNO, I think that is just completely unacceptable. A completely unacceptable timeline. And they'll give you a lot of good reasons about how, well, we just can't produce it that fast. Like, this is the best we can do. I don't care. That is not acceptable. Right? This is like a World War II time when if they said, you know, well, we can get a Manhattan Project will succeed by 1950, people said, no, that's not acceptable. And so the point I would make is that while we have to do a lot of work with our shipbuilders, you know, and I've spent time down at Groton, my colleague, Representative Whitman, was just talking about Newport News in this regard at a China committee briefing that we had this week. But no matter how much work we do to accelerate our shipbuilding, we are not going to make the 2020. We're not going to have 10 Columbia submarines by 2027. There's no world in which that's going to happen. And so while we need to tune up our shipbuilding, while we need to get these things out more quickly, in the interim, we have to have asymmetric solutions, and they have to be fielded at lightning speed.
How?
Well, you know, the DoD is trying to show how with the replicator program. And I think replicator is, I mean, you've read this about the news, and you probably know from a classified perspective even more details about it, but essentially they're trying to say, how do we quickly produce a large number of inexpensive attritable systems? And they're having some success. Now, I've been fairly critical of some of their timelines as well. We had our first replicator hearing, and they said, well, we're not moving as fast as Ukraine, but we're moving fast. I mean, Ukraine is a wartime economy. You can say, okay, well, they're under wartime pressure, but that means they have all extraordinary constraints. We don't have any of those constraints, and yet we're not moving as fast as them. We're not innovating as quickly as Ukraine. I go and talk to the services, and they're not training with drones every day, even though we know that's the future of warfare. Training every day so that they can innovate every day and improve every day the way that's happening in Ukraine. So look, Replicator isn't perfect, but it was set up in part not just to meet this immediate need for these attritable systems on the beaches of Taiwan, but also to really lay out a path for how DoD can do this more quickly. So it's pointed in the right direction. Thanks, John.
Katie Schroth.
Hi, I'm Katie Schroth. I am the Vice President for all the Department of Air Force work within the MITRE Corporation. So because I get the question a lot, what does MITRE do? It's probably worth noting. MITRE is a not-for-profit company that operates 6 federally funded research and development centers, looking out for the public interest. So this topic of deterrence is extremely interesting. We are looking at the aspect of integrated deterrence with things like economics, as well as nuclear and other things. Can you talk a little bit about how strategic cyber or non-kinetic effects may play a role in that broader deterrence picture?
Not much, because it's also highly classified. And so one of the interesting challenges this brings up is that when you have very exquisite capabilities, and cyber is a great example here, because They're very exquisite. We don't want to telegraph how they work, because then China will work at how to counter them. Cyber in particular, you use it once, and usually the adversary has a pretty fair chance of figuring out what you did. So you don't really want to have a demonstration, right? It's not like, we set up a nuclear weapon, and all the rest of the world says, holy shit, how do they do that? Well, we're not going to figure that out tomorrow. Whereas with a cyber attack, you use a cyber weapon, and they might know within 5 hours exactly what you did, right? So there are a lot of reasons why with cyber it's super classified, and we can't even telegraph to our adversaries what our capabilities are, even though they're pretty impressive. And the interesting challenge for us here is because we're not just trying to win a war, we're trying to deter a conflict. It's how do you figure out deterrence, integrated deterrence as part of integrated deterrence, in this context where you have all these really amazing capabilities, but you can't tell the bad guys that we have them. This is an issue with space as well. So I think that's a very interesting challenge in finding out the right balance. Admiral Paparo talked about Replicator in much more detail in the last couple of months than anyone ever has before. The things that he said in the last couple of months were highly classified as of like 6 months ago, right? So figuring out what that, sort of SOP is really challenging. And I think that comes back to some of the intellectual work that we need to do on these issues. So, I could talk for an hour about any of these questions. I could talk about for an hour, really put you to sleep. So we'll try to move quickly.
Thank you. Israel Solomon from Lincoln Laboratory, fellow FFRDC to MITRE. So another part of the government strategy with China and Taiwan is not to be so reliant on Taiwan, and hence the CHIPS Act. And, there was an interesting op-ed piece by Chris Miller from Chip Wars, who said that, the investment of the CHIP Act is going to help build a few foundries, which is good, but it's only going to decrease by a couple of percentage points, the overall picture. It won't change our fundamental dependence. And, he argued for an evolution strategy to invest in leapfrogging in advanced technology to recoup our dominance there. So I just, there's a lot of questions about the CHIPS Act now with the election, and I'm just curious how you see that part of our strategy evolving there.
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I was sitting on a panel with Chris Miller out at a conference in California a year or two ago. And some of my staff is getting nervous remembering this incident because it caused some headaches, but I'm very proud of it, so I'll tell the story. I was sitting on a panel with Chip Miller, Michelle Flournoy, Kevin Rudd, ambassador to the United States from Australia, former prime minister, and then Chairman Mike McCall, the Foreign Affairs Committee. So I was by far the least impressive person on this panel, and when we were talking about deterrence and everything, one of the other panelists brought up this idea, this point really, and said, look, it's a real problem that we're dependent on Taiwan and Taiwan might get invaded, so we really have got to be able to produce those chips domestically so that we're dependent on Arizona and not dependent on Taiwan. Now this makes a lot of sense, right? We understand why that would be good for the United States. But the interesting thing, coming back to these complicated notions of deterrence, is that saying, oh, we're just going to get all the chip foundry capabilities here in the United States so we're not dependent on Taiwan, that's a really dangerous thing to say for deterrence. Because the reason China thinks that we will come to Taiwan's aid is because we are dependent on them. And this is, by the way, part of why Taiwan has made and TSMC in particular, has made a very conscious decision not to give us the most advanced technology, not to try to produce the most advanced chips in Ohio or Michigan or Arizona, but to keep that domestic in Taiwan. There are other reasons why it's just technically difficult to do. But the point is that all of these economic decisions actually come back to this deterrence question. And so anyway, the panel story is that I brought up, having heard this point made and being not comfortable sitting on a panel of American officials where we're just saying, hey, we're going to take stuff out of Taiwan because that's bad for deterrence. I brought up the point, we think about deterrence in a lot of different ways, and there are different complex theories of deterrence. Like, for example, some people even think that we should just make a very clear, explicit promise to the Chinese that if you invade Taiwan, we're going to blow up the semiconductor factories. Now, one of the other panelists immediately jumped down my throat, which made me immediately ask, God, I wonder who her client is. But anyway, this is a very legitimate theory of deterrence. It is talked about in intellectual circles around this. The U.S. representative from Taiwan to the United States was a little bit upset by the comment. But actually, this kind of stuff really does matter. And so, while Chris is sort of right, I think, from a perspective of, we don't want to just continually be trying to catch up. We have to think about his recommendations in terms of what they mean for this conflict as well.
Brian Amaro.
Flip the switch up.
Brian
There you go.
Teradyne in North Reading.
Thanks.
So, question, you mentioned during the campaign there wasn't a lot of talk about this, and I agree. And do you have any sense of the trajectory or what we might be looking at in 2025, 2026 from the White House?
Well, I think it's going to be a lot of chaos on this. I know that's hard to imagine with a Trump administration. But the reason I say that very seriously is because I have worked very closely with Mike Waltz on China issues. He and I, in fact, it was a two-person codel, just the two of us, who went to Guam, the Philippines, and Taiwan. We did the first ever sort of U.S. congressional terrain walk, which is something we do in the military, to just try to understand, what will this battle look like? How will it unfold? It's something that a lot of subsequent codels have done. We had very high-level meetings in all these places and whatnot, and he and I, I think, are very aligned, probably 90%, on China policy. And I think that he is therefore very much in the mainstream of what we need to do to deter this conflict. But he's one person. He's a national security advisor, very important position. But on the other hand, you have people like the Secretary of Defense, if he makes it through his sexual misconduct issues, which seems to be a qualifying box for many of these nominees to check, who doesn't really think about China at all and really doesn't know anything about these issues. And then you have people who are just straight isolationists, think the nominee for Director of National Intelligence, who just don't want to get involved in any of these things whatsoever and think that you're going to deter a conflict with China by essentially saying, go ahead and have it, which of course is exactly what Trump said. So although people are quick to jump on Biden for being a little bit less ambiguous when we're supposed to have strategic ambiguity, and no one really knows whether he slipped up or it was intentional, whatever. But what's really dangerous for deterrence is having a U.S. commander-in-chief say, oh, I don't care about that island on the other side of the world, we're not going to defend it, which is what Trump has said. So I think there's going to be a lot of tension in this administration over what our China policy should be. But as long as they're listening to people like Mike Waltz, who will, I think, be, at least based on the other nominees, by far the smartest person in the room here, then we should see a continuation of policy. Kurt Campbell is essentially, as Deputy Secretary of State, is a very leading role in our China policy. His actual day-to-day work has a lot in common with what Matt Pottinger did on the NSC, focused on China under Trump. There's a lot of mutual respect between Kurt Campbell and Matt Pottinger. They're very closely aligned. So there's been a tremendous amount of continuity between the Trump administration's policy and the Biden administration's policy, despite the chaos at the top in terms of what these particular leaders are saying. We don't know if that's going to continue. We certainly, Mike Waltz will want to continue that. But there's going to, I think, be a lot of chaos and dissension, inside the room about exactly what that looks like.
John Griffin.
Thank you.
Hey, Congressman John Griffin from DIU. So I wanted to first thank you for your work on the China Committee, work on the HASC, and particularly your support to DIU and your positive comments about replicating. We know it's not going to solve all the problems, but thanks for acknowledging that we're contributing. And in particular, we're grateful for your support for the legislation that elevated Doug Beck to be a PSA and not be a political appointee, because we can keep hustling and not wait on a change of administration. So I offer that for specificity, not just general platitudes.
No, thanks, John.
So what I'm curious about is when you think about Replicator, or you think about other initiatives that we should be pursuing. Replicator's covering, as you know, attributable autonomous systems, and now we're doing counter systems. But I think, germane to this audience, one of the challenges is that how do we incentivize and mobilize like this audience and defense? Because it's not simply about just producing a new thing. So with your example like drones, putting thousands into a Paycom theater, also requires the simultaneous development of the algorithms for the AI, right? It requires our ability to build pipelines for the data sets, right, in order for the AI to work. We're not going to have availability to space, so we have to figure out how to move that through the spectrum. And then we know that like the energy required behind AI is like 10 times that of a normal like Google search. So now we have to think about like expeditionary mobilizing energy. How do we because we're all here to figure that out, like how do we mobilize and incentivize all of that to come together at once? Because we're still modeled under trying to be a subprime for a prime. I'd just be interested in your thoughts so we can make the idea better too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very sophisticated and very important question. And John, honestly, you've probably given a lot more thought to this than I have, because it is so specific, and you guys are totally leading the way at DIU. That's why I'm such a strong proponent of the program. And I don't know if you know this, but there was a moment when they were the appropriators were trying to cut funding to DIU completely. And myself and Steve Russell, an Army veteran from Iraq at the time in the Congress, were literally running around the House floor right before the vote to just get people to save DIU. And we succeeded in that. And you've been doing extraordinary things ever since. So look, one of the recommendations of the Future Defense Task Force was to double down on programs like DIU, because in some ways, if you could start all over, you'd make the whole Pentagon look like DIU. But since we can't start all over, let's at least really push the programs within the Pentagon that are being successful. You know, there's a couple things to try to get at your question here. What do we need to do? I mean, one thing is coming from the Pentagon. You know, we need to clearly signal to industry that we're not just going to be dependent on these big primes, and that's part of why I led an effort under the NDAA debate this past Congress to really hold Lockheed Martin accountable for their failures with the F-35. Not only because it's a real problem and taxpayer issue with how this money is being totally wasted right now. What we tried to do is say, you've failed so miserably at the software development for this airplane that under the argument of breach of contract, we're going to yank your rights back to the software and send it out. I mean, because the reality is that there are probably 10 companies in this room right now who are better at developing software than Lockheed Martin has proven it is. And they're the kind of people who should be developing the software. We shouldn't just be beholden to Lockheed when we've got a lot better software developers out there. So it was an effort to do the right thing for our national security, the right thing for taxpayer dollars, but also really a signal to the other primes to say, you're not just going to always be the kings of the castle here. And so I think part of what DIU needs to do and what the Pentagon needs to do is just have more contracts where the primes are sub to the innovators. Like I know there's, I think, an Army vehicle where Anduril is the lead contractor because it's mostly a software platform. And there's one of the primes is just producing the truck. You know, that's the way to think about it, right? Because it's just a truck. Like all you really have the truck for is just to carry around the exquisite electronics, right? So historically, we've always said, okay, who can produce the best truck? Great, now do the electronics to go on it. It's completely backwards. So the more that the Pentagon can show the primes, you might have to be working for one of these innovators. I think it will help really incentivize the community to produce more innovators, and then fundamentally for them to work together and not just try to, you know, sort of be subsumed or whatever. So there's a lot more to say about that, but that's one example of how we need to push the right direction.
Joe Coons.
Good morning, Congressman. Joe Coons from ARA. Great seeing you again. Appreciate your time. I always enjoy hearing your views because they're always up to date and unfettered in what the thoughts are, which is good. And I think they will provide good Thanksgiving dinner, at least in some households. Anyhow, it's a follow-on to the questions had from John and Brian. You know, and it's the next step. We've had an election. We got a new administration. We got a new Congress. Everything we're talking about doing will take funding. And you talked about running around the floor, maintaining appropriations for DIU. How do we get the right type of funding to have the Pentagon, quote unquote, do the right thing? Now, how do we enact it? Because it has to have incentives. There has to be some budgetary appropriations process behind it. So given the new election, it's a crystal ball question, I understand, but I would like to hear your thoughts on how this could play out and how we can help influence it.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Look, I'll give a couple of thoughts, but to be the real honest answer is we just really don't know what's going to happen, you know. And A lot of defense stocks have taken a real hit in the last week, as have a lot of pharmaceutical stocks, because we just don't know what these appointees will do, right? If you just look at Trump's economic plan, he wants to dramatically raise the deficit through some of his various economic actions and tax cuts and whatnot. That will put even more pressure on the defense budget. Interestingly, right now, we had a meeting just yesterday morning, I think it was yesterday morning. Okay, sorry, it's Thursday morning. Wednesday morning, that would be. It's hard to keep track of the days, sorry. We had a meeting Wednesday morning with on the bill, on the NDAA. I'm just trying to understand, where this is going, what our strategy should be and whatnot. And, right now it's House Republicans who want to keep the budget tied to, the sort of baseline established through one of these deals, because it's other people, Democrats are perfectly fine with a higher level, right? So the point is that it's conservatives like Speaker Johnson trying to set up Trump here who want to actually keep defense numbers low. And it's sort of more mainstream Republicans and Democrats who really understand national security who recognize we've got to make some more investments. Now, this is complicated because in some ways, if we actually were innovating much more, the cost would come down a lot. You could actually cut the defense budget because you're just producing fewer big, heavy, old, expensive systems and a lot more cheap new ones, right? But the point is that there will be a lot of, it's very difficult to predict how this will sort of play out politically, because there are going to be a lot of different competing pressures from unlikely corners, right? A lot of people in Washington don't expect the crypto coin Doge thing to be very successful. Successful for Elon for sure, but not successful at actually cutting the budget as much as they want. They're certainly going to try, but we don't know, right? And so if they prevail, there will be a lot of just cuts, and there will be a lot of downward pressure on the defense budget, especially if the tax cut gets renewed and there's huge deficits, right? Inflation goes up, all these things. But on the other hand, if people like Mike Walls in the White House prevail and say we need to invest more, and sort of traditional Republicans, I think Marco Rubio would be in this category as well, then maybe certain traditional areas of spending will increase. So it's very hard to speculate about this. Very hard.
Spending increase in the areas you're talking about, more drones, less tanks.
More drones, less tanks, that's right. And so that's, people like myself are going to advocate for that. But, the incoming administration really has a habit of just trying to help their friends. And if their friends are in those businesses, that's great. If their friends are in traditional businesses, then it's not so good, and we're not going to make very strategic decisions.
Have they tapped anybody from the borough yet?
Ben Linville Engler.
So MassTech is the state's economic development agency that focuses on competitiveness for the technology and innovation economy. We take a very integrated approach to defense and security for things like quantum, robotics, AI, cybersecurity, digital health, and most recently, microelectronics. So we've been the state's center of gravity for all chips and science pursuits. And at this meeting last year, I presented out that we had been selected to lead one of the 8 Department of Defense microelectronics commons hubs. I want to share with everybody, and 12 of the folks around this table are members of the hub. We are the strongest of the 8 hubs nationally. In this past year, we've grown from 80 member organizations in the Northeast region to over 235. That's 800 creative minds and knowledge and talent that exist. We competed with the other 8 hubs to win the most microelectronics commons projects around AI hardware, quantum, electromagnetic warfare, secure edge, and commercial leap-ahead technologies. And it's specifically the types of contracting you just described, not the primes leading, but small, medium organizations or academic institutions leading these. So in our state, we've answered the call for chips, and we're not the state that's going to have high volume commercial technology production, but we do have high technology, low to mid volume. And I think areas like this hub that we've established, this new Northeast regional sort of muscle that we can leverage potentially to support things like DIU is looking at. How do you see opportunities, setting aside all of CHIPS, but specifically the defense-related CHIPS funding going forward? Are there opportunities to expand microelectronics commons program? Are there opportunities to direct others that have been, that are working in the same area to take a look at some of what has come out of the defense-funded hubs to build out some more of these collaborations.
So Ben, thanks. I mean, the honest answer to this question is that we just really don't know what the next administration is going to do. And the two broad competing forces here, especially with regards to chips, are the fact that Trump doesn't like the Biden policies because they're Biden policies. And he has specifically said he's going to try to claw back money because Democrats spent too much, right? And when they say Democrats spent too much, they're thinking about the bipartisan infrastructure deal, which all my colleagues who voted against it nonetheless trumpeted in their communities. They're talking about the CHIPS Act, which everyone knows is fundamentally a good thing and was also bipartisan. But a lot of people just look, the conservatives in the House just say we shouldn't have done it. It was too much money, right? And they're isolationists, so they don't want to do things that are focused on national security. So there will be these two competing forces, one trying to claw back money and literally just try to eviscerate the infrastructure law, the CHIPS law, the Inflation Reduction Act, programs like that, and others that are, really trying to get the money out there and then just take credit for it. And I don't know who's going to prevail.
We have time for one last question, and the winner is Dave Modell with Triton Systems.
So I want to circle back a little on John's question and Ben's add to that. I applaud, we're in the innovation business at Triton, and lots of these companies are. The roadblock we run into with the primes is they still own the system, right? So they're going to say, no matter what, even if we have the better software or the better widget, I'm the integrator, thank you very much, we'll take it from here. So I'm interested, and again, apart from where the budget's going to go, where the politics are going to go, getting at that in the Pentagon, the procurement piece, funding the things that they say, well, it's great your innovation, but have you worked out your quality system? What's your supply chain? I mean, there's so many things that are necessary to integrate those technologies into defense systems that the primes hold the cards, and the little guys can't really get at those unsexy pieces in such a way to build the credibility that then they'll say, yes, you're ready to prime it. So I'm kind of interested in your thoughts on that.
David, this is where we need to change the approach to contracting. And it needs to happen from within the Pentagon fundamentally. But I want you to know that there are people like me sitting in Congress who are asking these really tough questions that are exactly up the alley that you're discussing. I remember sitting in a very classified discussion about some competing technologies for ballistic missile interceptors, for ballistic missile defense, right? And one of my questions was, we were going through the different ways that these discriminators work and use very advanced technology, some of which is developed right here in Massachusetts by some of you in this room. I said, how quickly can you update the software? I want to know, what is the process? Both from a legal perspective in terms of where you're allowed to get software updates and and whatnot, but also from a practical aspect, because like my iPhone updates in the middle of the night on an almost daily basis. And so having those people ask those questions and demand of the Department of Defense that you integrate that capability. One of the more specific questions was, if a competitor comes up with a better target discrimination software, are they allowed to compete to get that put in the missile? And the answer in this case was yes. Yes, but we've never done this before. So it is a big change, right? But that's the way we've got to push innovation. And I'm going to be pushing it from the Armed Services Committee. I know people like John are going to be pushing it from within the Pentagon. But I think it's also important for you, as you're competing with for these contracts, to voice these concerns to the Pentagon officials developing the contracts, that this is the way it needs to work, right? I mean, think about all the different, on this phone, think about all the different software developers who have software on this phone, because almost every different app, right? And that's where we need to go. All right, we're done. So let me just conclude by saying this: Happy Thanksgiving. I hope that I set the bar so low that even those of you who have difficult in-laws or whatever else will really enjoy Thanksgiving dinner, because it will be a cheerier discussion than this. But when I look around the room, and there are a lot of familiar faces, which is great, but I'm really proud of just how much innovation all of you represent. the talk I gave at the very beginning was about how central innovation is to our success. And there's so much innovation happening right here in Massachusetts. But even more amazing is to think, as we look at some like CEOs of companies and leaders of programs at MITRE or universities, it's amazing to think about how many other people you represent with your presence here. Because all of you have great teams. All of you have great teams representing a lot of people in Massachusetts and the region who are really driving our defense innovation. I want to quickly introduce two of the people on my team who are really critical to this discussion. Caroline Jones came up from Washington because she's my national security advisor and leads all of our defense work from Washington, D.C. Skip over the inconsequential guy next to him and next to her, and Tom Arsenault. Sorry, I got to make fun of Billy because he's with me all the time. Tom Arsenault is really your direct conduit through the district office, so probably you know Tom better than you know Caroline. But those are two really important people to make sure that your ideas and suggestions and critiques get to me. They do amazing work. I wouldn't be able to do this without them. And Billy helps a lot too. And Justin next to Tom down there too. We've got a great team, but I know you all have great teams as well. So make sure that when you go back to your teams, you convey my appreciation for all the work that they do. And make sure they know how important it is, because this is a team effort. There were a lot of companies in the middle of World War II who didn't maximize profits when they were able to tune up production, increase the rate of innovation, and produce the magnificent arsenal of democracy that won that conflict. That selfless approach to our national security is what is desperately needed right now. So I hope you will share that with your teams and be real leaders in this effort to keep our world safe. Thank you.